Good evening, everybody. How are you guys doing tonight? Thank you for coming out for another edition of our museum speaker series every month that we have. We are going to take next month off. I say that comically because next month we will work harder than we do the rest of the year, but we pause for the air show, obviously. August, we will be coming back with a young lady who has a story about her brother who flew Hueys in Vietnam. So that's going to be a really moving tribute that she comes and does a talk. September, we have September 11th. We will have members of the FDNY here. Right now we have 3 members. It's a roundtable discussion. But they were firefighters that were at Ground Zero on 9/11. So, and then following that, we have Ms. Fisek, who is a medical helicopter pilot. So she'll be here to talk about flying the EC-135 and EC-145. So pretty cool lineup. We have a few more lined up already. But appreciate you guys all coming out to see these. It makes it's just really nice to look out and see so many friends and supporters of the museum. Really appreciate it. So tonight we have a great talk, and it's one that I know a lot of you guys came out before, and we had a schedule change. But I told you, I promised you he would come back, and he did. He was very gracious to come out and join us. But tonight we have Jim Markel, who flew the F-8 Crusader, and it's one of my all-time favorite planes. I won't give away the ad campaign that Chance Vaught had about fighters and guns, but you guys know my history with liking airplanes with a lot of guns on them, hence the gunship nights. Jim is, you're in good hands with Jim. He's going to do just a great job and really tell about his career in Marine Corps aviation. So let's give a warm EAA welcome to our guest, Jim Markel.
Well, thank you very much, Chris, and welcome to all of you, and thank you. I'm pleased to see a nice crowd here this evening. I want to tell you, my name is Jim Markel, and I was in the Marine Corps active duty and reserves for 10 years, and I was lucky enough to fly the F-8 Crusader, which was my goal from the time I entered flight school. I was kind of a purist, and I wanted a single-engine, single-seat airplane that had guns in the nose. And the Crusader fit that bill, had 4 20mm cannon in the nose, and I was lucky enough when I finished flight school and was designated a naval aviator and commissioned a second lieutenant in the Marine Corps, that I had a choice when I got to El Toro between the Crusader and I could go to a brand new squadron that was flying the F-4 Phantom. And the colonel that was signing me in was dumbfounded that I wouldn't take the Phantom slot. And I said, no, the Crusader's always been a goal of mine, and I'd like to do that. As you may know, the competition between those airplanes was pretty fierce. Excuse me, I thought someone was signaling me there. But the F-8 was just a wonderful machine, and I'm going to like to tell you a little bit about it tonight. But I'm also going to tell you about how very fortunate I was in both circumstance and by desire. My flying in the Marine Corps, which I still revere as an organization, and particularly my fondness for naval aviation. I think they have the finest training regimen of any organization that exists out there. You stop and think about it. When I went through flight training, I first landed on an aircraft carrier in a piston-powered airplane when I had about 150 hours total flying time. And I first landed a swept-wing jet on an aircraft carrier when I had about 260 hours total time. Now, I have no special skills, but they just simply trained me, and repetition and paying attention to what was important and not being distracted by other things going on around you, like girls and things like that. But in any event, I did get distracted by one girl, and I'm pleased to introduce her. She's here tonight. My wife, Beverly. Darling, hold your hand up. And I think Bev was, between the two of us, is the one that deserves the medal for putting up with me, because this July, next month actually, we're going to celebrate 56 years of marriage. And to which I attribute her patience and hopefully good judgment. But we have a wonderful partnership and two wonderful children. They're not children anymore, but we're blessed with two. And Bev has been a terrific supporter, and I'm really pleased to introduce her to you. Okay, let's get started here. Talk a little bit about the F-8 Crusader, and let me see if I can get this equipment to work. Is that the Wright brothers up behind me? Good, okay. Well, I'm not going to tell you too much about the Wright brothers, but I think it is very interesting, the history, which EAA is so good about preserving, of aviation. This photo was taken in 1903. The F-8 Crusader took its first flight in 1955. Not very many years later, but just a world of advancement. One of the challenges following World War II, the engine guys could develop plenty of thrust, and particularly with the jet engine, but they hadn't quite figured out the aerodynamics yet. And the effort to try and get a tactical airplane to sustain the speed of sound was often fatal to those who attempted to do it. And the Air Force, or at the time it was actually the Army Air Corps, had a base out in California called Muroc Dry Lake, now known as Edwards Air Force Base, where they flew an experimental airplane called the Bell X-1. And the X-1 was a rocket-powered airplane, so it was taken aloft underneath a B-29 and then released. It had, I believe 6 rocket engines in it. And about a week before they were going to fly it, this is a story. So there's sea stories and there's true stories. I'm not sure which this is. But supposedly Bell's test pilot, because of all the fatal accidents trying to get airplanes to go supersonic, demanded a $100,000 bonus to fly the first flight in the X-1 to go supersonic. And there was a colonel, Army colonel, running the Muroc Dry Lake base, and he had a meeting with the Bell officials and some of his superiors, and they were discussing how they were going to get this done without having the test pilot that had experience in the X-1. And the colonel was reported to have said, well, we've got this captain out at the base. We pay him $400 a month and he'll do it. And of course they were referring to Chuck Yeager, who in fact did fly the X-1 and who in fact did exceed the speed of sound. And the one thing we've got to give tribute to the Bell engineers and many other aerodynamicists who had figured out that the problem with going supersonic was that as the airflow moved down the airplane and became supersonic at certain points, it created a shock wave. And when that shock wave formed at the surface, like an elevator on the tail, it would create flutter. That flutter would keep increasing until it eventually tore the tail off the airplane, and that's where all the accidents came from. The X-1 had an all-moving horizontal stabilizer. In other words, the elevator was no longer a hinged piece in the back. The entire horizontal stabilizer rotated. And that gave it the stiffness to be able to go through the transonic range, have the shock wave move all the way aft without causing any aerodynamic damage. And Chuck flew the X-1 to supersonic speeds in 1947. This picture is of the Chance Vought plant in Dallas, Texas, and they are building the F-8 Crusader prototype. Now they put it all together. They actually assembled the entire airplane, but then they disassembled it so that they could fly it out to Muroc Dry Lake for its first flight. And as those of you that are familiar with Edwards Air Force Base and so forth, the advantage there is that they have a huge runway. It's paved, and I think it's 12,000 feet, that then transitions into a dry lake bed, which is hard surface. So a pilot in a very high-speed airplane would probably have about 20,000 horizontal feet to be able to land and take off. This is the F-8 Crusader on its first flight out of Muroc Dry Lake. And that flight itself set a couple of records. It was the first airplane that went supersonic on its first flight. And this is 1955, by the way. And in addition, this is it landing, and that was the F-100 chase plane going overhead. Couldn't quite keep up. But in any event, the airplane was very successful doing that. It also was able to prove that the F-8 could sustain 1,000 miles an hour in level flight. And in those days, manufacturers frequently provided the financial support for the development of their product. And this was true of the F-8 as well. I mean, this is a huge investment by Chance Vought. So they're very promotion-minded. And so after the F-8 did that, Chance Vought formed the 1,000-mile-an-hour club. And when on my third familiarization flight, it was a single-seat airplane, so your first flight was a solo. Of course, I had all 300 hours and knew everything there was to know about airplanes. But in any event, we went out past Catalina Island, the Pacific Ocean, and accelerated out. And the Pacific Missile Range could see us out there and would plot our speed. And the controller called and said, you're doing 1,036 miles per hour. And so that qualified me as a membership in the 1,000-mile-an-hour club. And when I landed back at El Toro that day, the technical representative for Chance Vought came up and presented me with a lapel pin that said, member of the 1,000-mile-an-hour club. Of course, we always made a big deal of it. One thing I wanted to point out is I always got a kick out of the fact that one of the very first pages in the F-8 manual was instructions on how to get in the airplane. And you might think that's kind of basic, and I suppose it was. But it was a little bit different for a carrier-based airplane than it would have been for a land-based airplane, because aircraft carrier skippers don't like a lot of loose equipment on the deck. I mean, it could get blown by jet blast and become a hazard to personnel. So the F-8 had built-in hand and footholds so that you could climb up and get into the cockpit. The canopy rail on the F-8 was about 14 feet off the ground, so you needed some assistance to get up there. And it was interesting, on my very first flight, since it was a single-seat airplane, the way that the safety officer was in a separate airplane, or the instructor, and he chased you in another F-8, and he could talk to you on the radio. Also, we only used basic engine on takeoff. And I'm approximately right, but as I recall, the basic engine thrust on an F-8 in those days was 16,000 pounds of thrust. In afterburner, it had added about half that back in, so it was about 24,000 pounds of thrust with the afterburner going. Well, you're again, a 300-hour pilot, and you're taking off. If you use the afterburner, the 220-knot restriction on gear retraction and lowering the wing came up pretty fast. So we made those takeoffs in basic engine only. And so my first two takeoffs were in basic engine only. And you were kind of busy anyway, making sure that you didn't exceed that speed limit. This is a photo version of the F-8. You kind of notice the fuselage, forward fuselage is squared off, no gun ports, And that model was important because it was very effective in photo reconnaissance. Particularly in the Vietnam era, the ability to get over a target site, take the picture, and then get out again was key. So being able to do so at high speed was very important. There's John Glenn waving from an F-8 Crusader. He set a world speed record by flying from Los Alamitos in Southern California, it was a Naval Air Station at that time, to Floyd Bennett Field in New York, which was also a Naval Air Station at that time. And he did it supersonic, and it was a little bit under 4 hours, as I recall, with in-flight refueling. They tried to get the Air Force to cooperate with a KC-135 tanker so they'd have a jet to refuel from. And the Air Force didn't want to give the Marine Corps or the Navy any publicity, so they declined. So they used a Navy bomber called an A.J. Savage. And it was a twin-engine airplane that refueled John Glenn. He had a wingman, but during the first refueling, the wingman damaged the fuel probe on the wingman's airplane was damaged during a refueling attempt, so John Glenn completed the flight on his own. They got some publicity out of that. They called it Project Bullet because his average speed from Southern California to mid-state New York was the velocity of a .45 caliber automatic round. So pretty fast to go across. The one very distinguishing feature of the F-8 was it had a variable incidence wing, meaning that it went up and down. And when you stop and think about it, it's the wing that does the flying. And one of the challenges they had in the design was they figured out the fuselage they wanted to get this 1,000 mile an hour, but to get it slow enough to land on a carrier, they needed to get it very, very cocked up. And at that very high, nose-high attitude, the pilot had no forward visibility, so he couldn't see the deck for centerline line. So they developed. Now, if you look at that, there's a lot of moving pieces there. The entire leading edge droops down. The flaps and the ailerons on the trailing edge droop down, adds a tremendous of camber to the wing, and also it elevates the wing. So when you think about it, it's the wing that does the flying, so that effectively lowers the fuselage so the pilot can see out in front. And that wing design lasted a long time, and if you ever, there's a picture a little later on that I'll show you. A rod that holds the forward portion of that wing onto the airplane is about 1 inch in diameter, maybe a little bit less. And you think of that's exposed to a lot of forces, but it always stayed on. So it was. Let me see. Have I got an F-8 up there? In afterburner or? Yeah, okay. I wanted to show you the F-8 had what's called a hard light afterburner. That means that when you get it up to full basic engine RPM, the system injected raw fuel into the tailpipe and ignited it. And so basically it added rocket thrust to the airplane. And this is the only picture I could find of a Crusader. I never used the afterburner on a carrier launch, but this shot is of a Navy airplane where they did. And it was at dusk, so you could see the flame from the afterburner. I wanted to point out this picture. There's one feature toward the rear part of the airplane. Let me see. Let me see, I'm probably not illuminating that up there, am I? Well, anyway, it has ventral fins on the aft part. And the reason for that was the F-8 was very prone to spins when it got low airspeed and high G. And so to align the airflow, they put those ventral fins on there, straighten out the airflow, and helped its anti-spin capabilities. And on that picture, you can see right at the forward junction of the wing, you can see that rod that holds that wing, forward part of the wing on it. Not very big. When I arrived in Southeast Asia, I had individual orders to the 3rd Marine Amphibious Force, which controlled all Marines in the northern part of South Vietnam. And, you know, in a lot of other services, if you were a pilot, you may go from day one to retirement in the cockpit of an airplane. Not so of the Marine Corps. The Marine Corps' rule was that every Marine is basically a rifleman, whether you're a cook or a pilot or whatever. So you had these tours supporting the infantry. And the 3rd Marine Amphibious Force put 40,000 Marines ashore in an amphibious landing in South Vietnam in 1965. That was the first major troop buildup of that conflict. I was lucky enough, after half my tour with the grunts was over, I was sent to a fighter squadron at the Da Nang airstrip, which was in northern South Vietnam. And this was our squadron area. And at most of the time, especially during the rainy season, that dirt turned a reddish color and it was just simply everywhere. But it was pretty primitive conditions. When the first night I was in South Vietnam and I checked in, the bunker that housed the 3rd Marine Amphibious Force was under construction. And so I was billeted in some old French barracks at the airport. And I met a young infantry officer, and we became acquainted, and decided to go into town for dinner. At that time you could. You had to wear a uniform, but you could go into town. So we were at a restaurant in downtown Terrain, which was the town there. Beautiful. A sidewalk cafe, and very well lit, excellent French cuisine, and so forth. And I noticed that there was a photo shop next door and had a sign that said open. And so I asked Joy, I said, do you mind if I took a second? Because just before I left, Bev had asked if I had a photo that I could share with her. And so I went over and had this photo taken. Then I noticed that there's a little contrast between that and a year later. This is me in the operations tent of Marine Fighter Squadron at Da Nang, and it's probably about 3 or 4 in the morning, and I just returned from a mission that they euphemistically named a night special. And a night special was taking 4 airplanes, typically loaded with 8 500-pound bombs, and flying into Laos and hitting a target in a place called Chapone, Tchepone. And Chapone was an intersection of a couple of routes in the Ho Chi Minh Trail. They were taking munitions and other supplies into South Vietnam. And we wanted to interdict those supplies because they were being used against our troops. Those missions were flown typically in the wee hours of the morning. It was very mountainous terrain, and the area was illuminated by a C-46, a DC-3, with a Marine in the back kicking out parachute flares to illuminate the areas. And some of them were very good because they get the flare out of the airplane so that it was going straight down. Some of them had a tendency to kind of throw it, and this would cause it to swing. So we're on a target run, and one minute you see mountain, and the next you see down to the valley floor. And at the time, Secretary of Defense, you may remember the name Robert McNamara, had a philosophy. It was a numbers game that he used when he was an executive at Ford to measure success, how many rivets you could drive in an hour and so forth. Well, he measured how many runs we could make on a target. Now, most of us in our own leadership didn't think it was very wise to make multiple runs on the same target, because the gunner down below, after a while, pretty well knew where you were and where you were coming from. It was a little bit hazardous. So those missions were very trying, and I show the effects. Now, I'll also tell you that fighter pilots have a little bit of a reputation of knowing everything about everything. I will tell you, I was not one of those, but it was a very, I studied hard and I tried to do the best that I could. I wanted to show you a photo of the control stick in an F-8 because there's a couple of interesting things about it. Unfortunately, I couldn't locate a photo, but a friend in France, I'll tell you about this a little bit later, but the French Navy flew the Crusader for about 15 years while they were waiting for a new French carrier-based airplane to be produced. And they had a stick on display in one of their facilities. And if you look at that, that's kind of looking from the left-hand side of the stick, so the pilot was wrapping his hand around it. You can see the trigger in the front, and then you can see two red buttons off the side. One's kind of halfway up the stick and the other is down below. When the airplanes that I flew in Southeast Asia had been modified, they had hard points on the wings. This allowed them to have bomb racks attached so that we could be a true ground support airplane. And you had an armament selector on the panel, and that top red button would release whatever you had selected. The guns are kind of self-explanatory. You can see right in the forward part of the stick there's a trigger. The one down below engaged and disengaged the nose wheel steering when you were on the ground. When you were airborne, it fired the Zuni rockets. Now, what could go wrong? I mean, but actually, it actually worked pretty well. On the ground, the weight on wheel switch told the airplane it was on the ground, and that button would engage and disengage the nose wheel steering, which you only use at the very low speed part, seeing or the beginning and end of a takeoff or landing roll. This is a picture, I believe, of the Hancock. A lot of airplanes on board. If you look, let me see, it would be to your right, but that line of airplanes going all the way to the stern there, those are F-8s. The deck elevator, the forward elevator, is down. And there's another one, if you look to your right, you see an A4 kind of out to the side there. There's another elevator on the outside of the ship that led down to the hangar deck. And that's where all maintenance was performed. A couple of other interesting things. Just forward of the island, the bridge where the superstructure is, you can see a very large airplane. It's called a S2F. And it was designed as an anti-submarine type. And the one that's immediately in front of the island is a regular anti-submarine type S2F. Just behind it, you can see a couple of other examples with a huge radar disc on the top of those. And of course, the S2 retained the nickname of the Stoof, and then when they had the advanced version with the radar dome on top, they called it a Stoof with a roof. But it also shows you, I dearly enjoyed my time on aircraft carriers. It's the best example of management I've ever seen. I mean, I've been to many business management courses, but an aircraft carrier, you think modern day aircraft carriers have a crew complement of 5,000 people. They all have to be fed, kept clean, kept well, good health, Those airplanes have to work, and you have to store and load them with volatile substances like jet fuel and ordnance, and it works amazingly well. The discipline, I think, is one of the foremost reasons that it works so well. You don't find too much goofing off, and they're very strict on their drug policies and things along that line. Their rules are concrete. This is a Crusader on the catapult getting ready to be launched, and you see the blast fence up behind it. And there it is. Yeah, that's one of the greater thrills in a Crusader, because you're simply along for the ride. You're going from a dead stop. Am I running out of volume?
Try this mic. I think it's going to help give you a little more volume.
Okay. Everybody hear me now? Better? Thank you. But you go from a dead stop to 160 miles an hour in about 200 feet. And one thing, we would always keep a hand on the stick. I don't know if I've noticed of videos of like F-18 guys and so forth. They take their hands off and put them on a hand hold up by the windscreen. So, but we always put our elbow in our stomach and held the stick like this so that the force, the lateral G, would not cause us to over-rotate the nose. This is a shot of a Crusader coming in to take the barrier. And the barrier was used in a case where you had an airplane that couldn't get its tail hooked down, would be one example, and you're too far from land to send it to a land base. So this airplane is on an approach to take the barrier. The barrier was a rigged, you can see it there in the foreground of the picture. And this picture is taken from a Platt tape, and that was a camera buried in the deck that looked right up the desired glide slope. So you actually had a crosshair of where the airplane should be on approach. And this guy took the barrier and came to a stop. This one not quite so successful. Now, you can see that being a landing signal officer on a carrier, you had to be pretty alert because you're standing right at deck level, right about the point that these airplanes are touching down. And an incident like that, a ramp strike, there's a lot of pieces that are sliding down the deck. So to protect us, there was a net off the side by the LSO platform that you could dive into, and during training we had to jump into it. Now the deck of an aircraft carrier is about 60 feet off the water, and of course you're conscious of where the water is because there's the wake of the ship is passing by, but jumping into that is not the most natural thing that you ever do. It's a little bit fearful, but fortunately saved a lot of people. The F-8 was called the MiG Master early in the conflict in Vietnam, and a lot of that was attributed to the fact that, yes, it did carry Sidewinder missiles, which are heat-seeking missiles, and most of the MiG shoot-downs by F-8s were accomplished with Sidewinders. But because the F-8 had the guns, they were able to press the attack with the guns and oftentimes score a victory. And the numbers of that, the F-8 was involved in 92 MiG engagements. It downed 89 MiGs against 3 losses. 89 to 3 is a pretty good ratio. Now, other airplanes had greater success. I mean, the F-4s of both the Air Force and the Navy, but there were many more of them. They only built 1,200 Crusaders total, and I think if you look at the Vietnam era, there was over 3,000 F-4s that rotated between the Air Force and the Navy being in the theater. The F-8, in addition to holding the record for being the first production airplane to sustain 1,000 miles an hour in level flight, was also in 1955 awarded the Collier and the Thompson trophies for aerodynamic advances. And it really was, I enjoyed flying that airplane so much, and you never, well, there's a couple of exceptions. I did in my civilian life, I did some work for a company in Dallas that I audited their flight department, and one of their pilots had been an F-8 pilot on a carrier. And there's a saying, when you're out of F-8s, you're out of fighters. And he had that posted in his cubicle in the hangar, but it said, when you're out of F-8s, and then the rest was crossed out, it said, you're out of danger. And it did have, the airplane had a very high performance rate, but it did have a loss of control problem, and spins were largely irrecoverable. So people that got into spins usually ended up ejecting, and there are quite a few of those. I've forgotten how many, but there are quite a few. I think out of the 1,200 airplanes that were produced, 1,100 of them were involved in an incident or accident of some type. Obviously, many of them were recovered and repaired and returned to service. Aerial refueling was one of the more, carrier landings and aerial refueling probably took the greatest amount of skill, because you had to depend on your mental image of where you were in space, in time, to get the airplane in the right position. Now what this is a picture of an A4. It has what's called a buddy store on it, which is a belly-mounted tank that had a hose and a drogue mechanism in it that the pilot could extend to refuel other airplanes. And it's extending the drogue right now. And when I say it takes a little bit the pilot's head relative to where the probe is, you cannot look at it, because if you look to the left, you'll inadvertently turn to the left. So you have to kind of figure where the probe is, look at where the drogue is, get it lined up, and then drive the airplane forward until it engages for refueling. That was a challenge, and particularly at night, because at night that drogue was illuminated by 3 little dot lights around the periphery. I want to point out, here's some of my squadron mates when I was in Vietnam. And I first want to point out that the airplane behind it is loaded with 8 500-pound bombs. I can tell that because there's 4 on the right side, and I assume there's a balancing load in the back. If you'll notice, the back end of those bombs has a rather unusual looking attachment to it. Those were like speed brakes for a bomb. When the bomb was released, those extended out into the airstream, and they slowed the velocity of the bomb. Because at time of release, it's going the same speed as the airplane, which typically is 450 knots. The problem with that is, if you had to drop from a lower than standard altitude, you were then in the bomb blast area. And so what it would allow you to do is to release the bombs at a much lower altitude. This retardant device would cause the bomb to trail the airplane, and then you'd be clear of the shrapnel. The gentleman that's on your far right in this picture is Rainer Revis, son of a Baptist minister from Waco, Texas, proud graduate of Baylor. And Rainer is still with us? Pardon me? Can I check that? Oh, yes, you're right. You're correct. He's on my left, too. I just got confused. Thank you, darling. You see why our marriages last so long. She helps me out. Rainer on the far left, and he's still with us. And one of the saddest experiences I've gone through, I don't know if you've had any association with people with dementia, but he has lost all memory of his past life. And I used to call him every Sunday. He was committed to a facility in Hilton Head, South Carolina. And for quite a while, he would remember who I was and what our association had been, most of it. But then about 3 months ago, he said, "Who is this? Where are you from?" He didn't know. Now, this is a guy I served in 2 squadrons with, and we did a lot of work together as civilians after we left the military. Wonderful guy, but a very sad experience. Anyway, he's confined to this facility and will be for the rest of his life. Then going from your left, thank you, darling, that's me, and then the gentleman on my left in this picture, be the second from your right, is Bill Ridings. Bill was a little bit older than the rest of us. His call sign was the Eagle. Now, not the EAGLE, but the IGGLE. And I don't know where he got his Bronx accent, but he was a very interesting and very colorful guy. With his shaved head and Roman nose, he kind of looked like an eagle. And he played that to the end. But he was an excellent pilot, and he had great faith in his ability. And there's many famous stories I could tell about him, but my favorite is before he got into Crusaders, his squadron flew the North American FJ, and the FJ was the naval version of the F-86 that the Air Force flew. So it had a tail hook, and the Eagle was out on a flight as a wingman of a squadron CO. They came back to Beaufort, and the leader could not get his left main gear to indicate down. So the Eagle says, "Oh, no problem." Now they stay at pattern altitude. They're at 1,000 feet. So the Eagle goes underneath, and he looks up and he says, "Oh yeah, the uplock didn't release." He said, "Maybe I can knock it loose with my wing." So he gets underneath, and he gets his wing up into the wheel well of this FJ. It turns out that the dimensions of that wheel well and the width of the wingtip were about identical. So the 2 airplanes stick together and start to roll, stuck together at 1,000 feet. So as the Eagle describes it, he also had colorful expressions. He said, "We were like boys killing snakes in the cockpit trying to break loose." Finally, at about 500 feet, the airplanes did come apart. They were able to recover. The left main gear of the leader came down, and they both landed successfully. So the Eagle was probably in line for a court-martial, but he was a hero for that, and a very colorful guy. The gentleman to your far right is Willie Alvord. Willie was a very colorful character. One of his famous expressions, after he had tried to talk his wingman into taking a picture of him while he was in a very heavy flak environment. So he thought that it would be great to have a picture of he and his airplane with all this flak exploding around him. Most of us desired to stay away from that kind of thing, but Willie was a very colorful character. To give you an idea, one of his most favorite expressions was "better dead than look bad." So he he did some colorful things. He came to see me when he had turned 60, I think it was. He had been with Continental Airlines, and he had been an instructor in their training department. And he wanted to know if I could help him with a job in civil aviation. And I said, well, Willie, do you have a license? And he says, yeah, I have a commercial pilot's license. I said, well, you probably need to have an airline transport pilot license to be employed. And I tell you, if you have no experience in business-type airplanes, probably not much I can help you with. But we had a nice chat, and I said I'd keep an eye open. Several weeks later, he was living in Laguna Beach with a young lady, and he decided that it was time for him to get in shape so that he'd be eligible for more employment. So he put on his tennis shoes and his sweatshirt, and he collapsed at the bottom of the driveway and was gone to a massive heart attack right then and there at age 60. And so we lost him. But he was a very, very interesting and nice guy. Now, I'm not the only person that really loved the F-8. I ended up with over 1,000 hours of flying it, which is fairly unusual for a Marine because we kept being rotated to these other duties. But when the F-8 left the U.S. fleet, that was 1987, they had a huge party at the Naval Air Station Miramar, north of San Diego, and over 3,000 people showed up, and they called it the last Crusader Ball. They had such a good time that some Navy guys who were retiring in the San Diego area said, we ought to continue this. So in August, Bev and I are going to, I've forgotten what it is, a 33rd or something, last annual Crusader Ball. So there is a sense of humor in there, and our ranks are kind of thinning. The crowds aren't as big as they used to be, but we'll get a couple of hundred former Crusader pilots. And included that group, I'll cover it in a little bit, is that when it went out of the U.S. fleet, we gave airplanes to the Philippine Air Force and to the French Navy. And the French Navy was very active with the F-8s. They had, I think, 2 or 3 squadrons, and they flew it from 1988 until the year 2000, when it was replaced by a French-built carrier-based airplane called the Rafale. And then the Crusaders went out of service. I did, as a result of this Crusader Association, I met a young fellow from France. His name is Chris Monnier. He's not an aviator, but he is an airplane enthusiast, and he's a writer. His main occupation is he sells pharmaceuticals and medical supplies, and I think he's very successful because, as you know, most Europeans will have a pension or what we'd call a condominium downtown, and then maybe have a plot of land out in the country somewhere. Chris lives in a big stone house in the south of France, so I think he does very well financially. But Chris is also a collector, and one of his possessions is a 1984 California Highway Patrol Harley Davidson, complete with radio, siren, and everything else. And Chris also has a full uniform, metallic gold helmet, khaki uniform. And if you've ever seen a California highway patrolman, I don't know how they get these guys together, but they have a crease goes down through the pocket of their shirt, and it lines up with the crease in their trousers, and they're spit-shined boots, and they're really good-looking guys. So one day, on a sunny Sunday, he's cruising around the south of France, and this is about the time that the French Navy is transitioning out of the Crusader into the Rafale. And a flatbed truck crosses his path, and on the flatbed is a whole F-8 Crusader. So he makes a turn, he follows it to a recycling yard where they're going to melt it down for the aluminum and magnesium and everything else in there. He cuts a deal with the owner of this yard to buy the airplane and having delivered it to his house, for which I awarded him the Husband of the Year award. After a year or two, I think largely through the urgings of his then wife, he's no longer married, by the way, and his neighbors, they decided that maybe a 56-foot long fighter was not a suitable lawn ornament. So he had the wrecking yard come back out, and they cut the back end of the airplane after the cockpit off. And then he mounted the cockpit and nose area on a set of wheels. And Chris is a very clever guy. The airplane was old enough that he couldn't get a lot of the flight instrumentation to work, particularly like the gyro and so forth. So he had photographic images, and he installed flat screens in this cockpit, and he completely duplicated the cockpit and got it all to move as if the airplane was flying. He's detailed down to, he found a surplus Navy test unit for the pitot-static system on the airplane. And that's, as many of you know, is what drives the airspeed and altimeter and so forth. So he could get all those gauges, rate of climb and everything else to work, and he could control them by controlling the air pressure that was going into the... and he donated it to a French fighter museum in the south of France. And it's on my bucket list to go visit that. It actually flies, this cockpit. And the three of us in this picture, let me make sure I've got this right, from your left to your right, the guy is, on the left is a Navy veteran by the name of Rich Kiefer. He served in VF-13, and we kid him a lot because while we were all perspiring in tents in Southeast Asia, he was on a cruise in the Mediterranean on a fighter squadron. Then me in the center. The fellow on the far right of your screen is John Doherty, call sign Dork. I'm not sure how he got that name, but he's a very entertaining guy and a great sense of humor. As a matter of fact, Bev and I, when we go to these, he's still around, and the first thing she wants to do is sit down and listen to Dork tell some stories. But I want to show you, he had one very interesting mission, and this is the result. This is his airplane. We pushed the airplanes pretty hard. We flew them overweight, part of Secretary McNamara's edicts. And Dork was number 3 in a flight of 3, each with 2 2,000-pound bombs on board. And he was number 3, and we, at that point, to give a little bit of interval, we would take off in what's called a burner light interval. So number 1, who in this case was the skipper of the squadron, the commanding officer, he goes to full power, checks his gauges, kisses off, and he starts his takeoff roll. When number 2 saw the burner light, excuse me, that was number 2 was John, saw the burner light, then he released. So he's probably 800 to 1,000 feet behind. The skipper, when he gets down to about rotate speed, which was interesting because I was a safety officer of the squadron at the time, and in doing the accident investigation, I found out that the rotate speed was higher than the limitation on the maximum tire speed. So that's how far overweight it was. And the right tire blew. And that's probably just from an overstress, from going a little too fast with too much pressure. The carcass of the tire flew off the airplane and down John's intake. So the skipper had already called the tower because he knew he blew a tire. He put his tail hook down and he let the tower know that he was going to take the midfield arresting gear. So John's there in his airplane, and with the carcass of the tire down there, it's starting to compressor stall and lose a lot of thrust, and he really had no place to go. But he had enough velocity that he was able to reef it off and kind of just had enough energy to go over the skipper's airplane, and coming down the backside of that arc, he ejected. Now, I figured he was way out of the envelope of the seat. The ejection seat at that time, made by an English company, you had to be straight and level, a minimum of 120 knots. Well, he was probably 120 knots, but he also had a little sink rate, but anyway, he successfully ejected. The airplane crashed off the end of the runway, and one thing that we talked about a lot afterward is that morning, that very morning, we had a briefing from the ordnance guys how unless you arm these bombs inside the airplane and release them, they would not detonate in a high order explosion. The way that worked was, on the front of the bomb was a little propeller, and then there was a very stiff wire that was affixed to the underside of the wing that went through a hole in that propeller shaft. So when you dropped the bomb, it fell free of that wire, the propeller would rotate, and the bomb would arm. Well, he never released any bombs, and we had one in the crash was a low order where the bomb cracked open, and all the powder went off in a big type, but not a lot of damage. The other one went off in a high order explosion, and it did a lot of damage, knocked John down, who had just picked himself up off the ground. Well, he fell down twice, actually. The first time was because he forgot to release his parachute, and it hooked on a bush, and he fell over from the restraint of the parachute strap. He got out of that, and the next was he was knocked down by the concussion of this other 2,000-pounder going off in near proximity. Fortunately, by the grace of God, you know, a 2,000-pound bomb is a lot of ordnance, and there's a lot of metal flying around. None of it hit him. And so he was fortunate. He regained his composure. He said, fortunately, he had the good sense to keep his helmet on through all this, and probably saved his hearing as well. But he had crashed off the end of the runway, and a perimeter road went around the Da Nang airstrip. The Marines were on one side of the airstrip, and the Air Force was on the other. John walks up to the perimeter road, and the first vehicle coming around is an Air Force Jeep. So he thought, well, I'm in luck because they have a lot nicer club than we do, which was true. So he flags it down. They ask him where he wants to go, and he said, I want to go to the Doom Club. And that was the name of the Air Force Club in Da Nang. It was the Da Nang Officers Open Mess, the Doom Club. So he went over there, and unbeknownst to us, we can see from the Squadron Ops area, huge flames, explosions, everything else going on. And of course, after the 2,000-pounder went off, then the resulting fire started cooking off the 20-millimeter ammunition. And so they were going off with great frequency, and there were 400 rounds out there in this fire. We thought John was in the wreckage. We didn't recover him until, gosh, it was late that night, 11 o'clock or so, and this accident happened at maybe 2 in the afternoon. But he's still around and still a colorful character. So. Oh, well, that was kind of I've got to be careful there. I can't mention any names in case they're still around. But, you know, I showed you the slide, said you can tell a fighter pilot, but you can't tell him much. Sometimes you can't train him quite as well as you'd like to either. I'm reviewing the tower tapes from this accident to get the timing of everything. And you hear the skipper call, say he's taking the arresting gear. Then you hear a call from somebody who said, number 2's ejected. Then you hear a little pause, and the number 3 said, number 3's airborne, switching button 2. He's totally unaware that his leader's in the gear. The number 2 guy has crashed off the end of the runway. He's all by himself out there. He's calling for a switch to the tactical frequency. I don't know how many of you have seen the comic strip Pogo. That's an alligator. This is, I noticed that most of this group is younger than I am, so you may not remember the comic strip, but this was written by a cartoonist by the name of Walt Kelly, and it was always very humorous. But his main character was an alligator who walked on his hind legs and would frequently have an army helmet on. And there was one cartoon that I remembered, and I wanted to use it in this presentation. So I looked up online and found out who owned the copyright on those cartoons. And I was directed, sent him an email, and I got an answer back. First a phone call from what sounded like a younger fellow, but his last name was Kelly. I believe he was either a grandson or a nephew of Walt the cartoonist, who had passed away by then. But I asked him for permission to use the cartoon. He said, no, you can't do that, but you can use the text. And I said, well, that'll serve my purposes. And what the text of this cartoon said was, here's Pogo reporting to a superior officer saying, we have met the enemy. He is us. And there's a lot of truth to that. In a combat situation, you have a lot of dangerous materials and dangerous things going on around you, some of which are coming from your own side. And so we occasionally met the enemy, and he is us. My best illustration of this, again, can't use any names, but we had a mission into North Vietnam that I was leading one day, and we would hit a target with bombs. Then we would go out to sea and go north a little bit, and then we would do what's called a road recce, a road reconnaissance, looking for targets of opportunity, particularly any trucks coming south on the main highway, because that's taking supplies to people that are trying to hurt our troops. And we were at that point, we cleaned off the bombs, so we had the 420mm cannon, and we each carried 4 Sidewinders in case we had an air-to-air engagement. And after we made the road reconnaissance, we would check each other over for battle damage as we went feet wet was the expression, but turned out to sea so that you're over the Gulf of Tonkin. And when I went underneath this airplane, I noticed that one of the Sidewinders on the left side was no longer in the rack. And I called him on the radio. I said, what happened to your number 1 Sidewinder? And he said, oh, it came off when I turned the master armament switch off. Now this guy's flying in trail on me. And a heat-seeking missile comes off the rack, and he doesn't bother to notify anybody or shut anything down. So sometimes you've met the enemy, and he is us. I don't often talk about myself or write about myself, but I was honored in October of '66 with a Distinguished Flying Cross. And I value that highly because, for one thing, Marines at that point, it was early, I was over there in '65 and '66. So early in the conflict, and not many Marines had received decorations of any magnitude. And this probably qualified as one. And it does say at the bottom, for heroic achievement in aerial flight. And I read that because I want to tell you folks, I'm not a hero. I was very, excuse me, very well trained and sometimes delivered under very challenging circumstances. But it was my training that kicked in and allowed me to do these things. The mission I was on, I was launched off what was called a hot pad. And a hot pad was actually kind of favored duty because the temperature in Southeast Asia for most of the year can get pretty high during the day. And this was an opportunity to get in an air-conditioned environment because the hot pad was a trailer hooked to a semi-tractor that they would pull up and park adjacent to our area, and it had a self-contained generator. And inside were a couple of bunks and air conditioning. And so one day I'd had that duty before, never got launched, but what we would do when we would check in an hour before, and you would go out to your airplane, which was parked in a special location that was roped off, you would get in it, and I think I mentioned to you that the F-8 had no battery, so you needed the ground support equipment to get it started so it could be self-sustaining on its own generator. And we would start it up. The plane captain would come out and run us through all the pre-flight checks, and then we would shut it down, leaving the ground units attached. So we were ready to run out from this trailer, hop in, and fire up, and we were right adjacent to the end of the runway. And I think the record was we got airborne in like 1 minute and 12 seconds. Pretty quick, considering you got a lot of jet airplane to make sure it's working right. So in any event, we're in this trailer. I'm actually taking a little snooze because air conditioning is pretty nice to sleep in. And the instrument to alert us that we had a call coming in was a klaxon horn, like a submarine, you know, when they're diving, honking noise, a klaxon horn, and it went off, and we got a frequency and a general heading. So we were all geared up, ran out to our airplanes, everything was set up, climbed in, fired up, and we were right adjacent to the runway and took off. Followed the initial vector, and the weather in the target area was not very good. It was in the Ashau Valley, and ceilings were between 800 to 900 feet. And we had 1,000-pound bombs on board, and we couldn't use those because we needed to be higher than that to drop those and stay out of the fragmentation pattern. But as we approached the area, there were already 8 airplanes on site. And so this was apparently a pretty critical mission. There were 4 A4s off of Dixie Station, which was the aircraft carrier off South Vietnam, and there were 4 Air Force F-100s from a base in Thailand. So these 8 airplanes were milling around above the clouds and hadn't found a route to get down below. What they were trying to do was to protect a reconnaissance patrol that was out, and this happened to be a, quote, this is a euphemism, a reinforced reconnaissance platoon because it had 9 guys instead of 7 because it had 2 Browning automatic rifles. Usually you only had 1 in a squad. Well, their mission was to go out and scout an area and then report back what they spotted. Well, what they spotted was pretty significant. There were these large vessels, 200, 300 foot boats coming down this river loaded with supplies and being offloaded to a trail that went off the side of the river. And those were carrying munitions, food, and they had a group of, I'm assuming they were Viet Cong, but they were black pajamas and pointy straw hats, and they were humping all this gear up a trail off the road. And they were spotted not only by the reconnaissance platoon, but also by an Army guy in an O-1 Bird Dog. And you may not know what that is, but an O-1 Bird Dog is an observation plane based on a civilian Cessna 185 but instead of having a cabin, it had tandem seating. And they flew these out of a little airstrip not far from the Da Nang airport called Marble Mountain. And that was a helicopter base and had a short runway for these L-1 bird dogs, flown by an Army aviator with a Marine artillery spotter in the back. Now, in this small airplane, he was able to get underneath the overcast and kind of scope out what the situation was. So when I checked in with him, he said, well, I'd love to have you strafe this area. And I said, well, I'm not sure if I can do it. I've got 2 1,000-pound bombs, and I need to get a pretty good pull-up because I need to get back through this overcast and get on top and hope I'm still over the river because the river didn't have any mountains in it, which is... so in any event, on the first pass, I was able to get a few rounds off, but as I went to pull up, the airplane shuddered pretty good from carrying that load. So I said, on my next pass, I'm going to jettison these bombs and I'll be able to do a better job for you. So I was able to, I found a little seam in the clouds and I could see the river through this seam. And I knew that mountains didn't typically grow out of rivers. So I got down on the river and I was able to strafe low deflection shots. And on the first pass, I also was able to jettison those 2 1,000-pound bombs that were kind of hindering my ability to maneuver. When I would come off the target, I'd put a pretty vigorous pull-up into the overcast, probably 7 or 8 Gs, and I paid very close attention to what my heading was because I was over the river, and I knew what the area that I was in, it went relatively straight. Then when I got up high enough where I could do a turn, I watched the turn and bank indicator, did a standard rate turn because as you know, as you slow down, it decreases the radius of turn. What I wanted to make sure was that I came back down on the same angle that I went up so that I had clear space below me, a river rather than a mountain. And I did that successfully 5 or 6 times. And with the 20 millimeter and the Zuni rockets, I was able to back off the effects of both the coolies that were transporting the goods, and then there was a company of North Vietnamese regulars behind them, and they backed off far enough that they were able to get some helicopters in to extract all 9 of the reconnaissance patrol. So I felt very good about that. Oh, this is kind of interesting. You notice the left gear collapses when he touches down? And the airplane rolling out, it looks like flame, but what it is actually fuel. Fuel, excuse me. Thank you, Don. Fuel streaming out of the main fuel line ran through the right-hand wheel well. So when that landing gear broke off, the stub went through this very large fuel line. And many of you probably already know this, but in a jet, on a carrier landing, as soon as you touch down, you go to full power. Of course, when he did that, he got no response because all the fuel is leaking out of the side rather than going through the engine. And I got, I've forgotten which carrier this was, but I did do some research and I found out that the angled deck on this carrier was 800 feet long. And at the time that he touched down, he was doing about 200 feet per second. So he had 4 seconds to touch down, realize he had a problem, and then eject while he was still airborne. And he managed to do that. So I'll show that to you one more time. These were still photos. So he touches down, you can see the fuel leaking. He's going to, you can tell that he's expecting to do a go around. See how the nose gear is off the deck? He's already given it some back stick to go around because as soon as the airplane leaned over from the loss of that landing gear. The hook disengaged from the wire. And you probably can't see it, but on this next one, you can see him. He's just reaching up. The ejection trigger in naval airplanes is a face curtain. And the reason for that is that you get two hands on it, puts you in a kind of an erect position because basically it's a howitzer shell firing that seat out of the airplane. So back injuries are very common. I want you sitting as erect as possible. And the face curtain gives you a little bit of protection from the air blast. So as the airplane is leaving the deck, he ejects. You can see the canopy raising as the first phase of the ejection. And there he goes. You can see the canopy back part of the airplane. The drug chute is out, and he's tumbling a little bit, but he's very low. Very, very low. And you can just see the starting to stream here, and he hits the water. This gentleman, I don't know him. His name is Terry Cryway, and I believe he's still around. But he survived this. He had some burns on his neck from the straps of the chute, but that was the extent of his injuries. And there he is going into the water. Well, what happens to an F-8 pilot when he's not getting in the cockpit anymore? Well, actually, I did keep getting in because after my 7 years of active duty, I went in the reserves, and I flew out of NAS, Naval Air Station Willow Grove in Pennsylvania, which is not far from Philadelphia. This is, actually I was still in the Marine Corps, but this is Bev and I, and she came to visit me when she was working for TWA, and I lived on St. Simon's Island, and I arranged at a small airport there called Golden Isles Municipal. That area is kind of a resort area, St. Simon's and Jekyll Island being beautiful places. And so I rented, can you hear me okay? I can hear this going in and out, I'm sorry. I rented a Cessna 172, and her folks had already moved from Pensacola to Henderson, Nevada, but her second oldest brother and his family lived in Pensacola. So unbeknownst to Bev, I called his sister-in-law, and I told her who I was, and she said, "Oh, yes, I've heard of you," which concerned me a little bit. In any event, I said, what I'd like to do is surprise Bev. She's coming to visit me next week. And I thought I would rent an airplane and we'd fly over to see her. She said, "Oh, that'd be great." And so I suggested a day. She said, "Oh, that's perfect. We'll be at a Little League game with some of the kids, but we'll pick you up and you're more than welcome to stay with us." So I got to meet, Bev has just a wonderful extended family. And I need to tell you a little bit about her parents. You know, Pensacola is really the Deep South. I call it Baja, Alabama. I mean, it's really in the South. And her mother and father were known as Big Mama and Big Daddy. And they decided that they should get their whole extended family together every summer with what they called Beach Week. And so starting from, I don't know, our kids were pretty young the first time we went down to Pensacola, and the entire family fit in a little rental concrete block beach house that we rented for several years, and I don't know how many of us were in there. Kids on the floor everywhere, and we had just a wonderful time. But Bev has the most wonderful family, and everything, you know, we sit down for dinner. Bev's second oldest brother, Joe, who sadly passed a few years back, used to have us count off. We'd stand in a big circle and count off. And I think the last time I remember, 63, does that sound right to me? Yeah, but 63 people there. Kids, grandkids, nieces, nephews, great-grandkids. It was really a very nice, so I'm lucky to have inherited that wonderful family. What happened to the Crusader after that? Well, this is the F-8U-3. And as you can see, it was a little bit larger airplane, a little bit different shape of an inlet, but followed the same basic design philosophy. And they were still trying to sell the Navy on a single pilot airplane because it was less expensive. They already had a lot of the design features from the earlier F-8. And something interesting, you don't see any ventral fins coming out of the back end. This airplane had them, but they made them much longer to cure the spin tendency, so they retracted. So for takeoff and landing, they were retracted. And then in the flight mode, they'd extend, but too long, they would scrape on the ground if you left them extended for landing. But they built, I think, 4 or 5 prototypes and flew them, but lost out to the F-4 Phantom. And I can tell you that the last version that I flew had a very sophisticated radar in it. But with one guy in there, you were a busy fellow. I mean, you had to identify the target, you had to illuminate it, you had to lock on, and you had to make sure it wasn't a friendly. As a matter of fact, the rules of engagement in Vietnam were you couldn't fire unless you'd made a half-a-mile ID pass. That's pretty close with a couple of airplanes going 500 knots or more. But I can see why the second guy. Unfortunately, the whole thing was sold to Congress on the idea that, well, hey, we've got this airplane with 2 guys and 2 engines and everything else, and you could shoot the enemy before you can ever see them. Well, if you look at how conflicts develop, you really can't do that because you got a lot of friendlies out there, and the possibility of friendly fire. I mean, if you launch a bunch of heat-seeking missiles in given airspace, it's going to seek the hottest source. And if that happens to be a friendly airplane, you've just had a friendly fire incident. So anyway, there's a couple of feelings. I always liked the idea of one guy, one engine, and worked out pretty well. What else? Oh, here's the Crusader 3 on its maiden flight. It's also out at, I think by this time, no, it was still New York Dry Lake, I believe. You can see why they use that. When one of those lakes goes dry, it's hard packed, it's smooth, and it doesn't have a lot of sand contact. So it's, and you can see there's the F-8U-3 coming back in for a landing. Would have been a terrific machine, but they couldn't sell it. And it was a couple $1 million a copy, less than an F-4. But anyway, it had less to operate because only one engine and one person. What else did it do with the F-8? Well, NASA acquired several. One advantage was the wing was on top of the fuselage, so you could unbolt it and remove it with a crane. And NASA was doing supercritical wing research. So they got these F-8s, pulled the old wing off, and then designed, built, and mounted to the same mountings. It didn't go up and down, but it mounted to the same mountings, a supercritical wing. And that was an attempt to figure out the perfect shape to have airplanes have good aerodynamic qualities and also be able to go supersonic. And so they built this airfoil that had a very thick inboard cross section, and they mounted it on a couple of F-8s, and they did fly it. Here's one, and they did this to several airplanes, but sadly unable to sell it. This is an honors conception. Now, I mean, I love engineers. I mean, they're all good guys. But, you know, an engineer decided one day that, well, hey, if an airplane will go faster if its wings are swept, why don't we make one that has one swept forward and one swept aft, and we'll get the same benefit but a lot lower construction costs. So they never, to the best of my knowledge, they never actually built this airplane. But I did find this artist's conception of a swing wing so that you could fly it with one wing swept forward and one wing swept aft, and then to come in for a carrier landing, it would be straight across, and of course a straight wing airplane could fly at a lot slower speeds. What else? Well, we gave a number of F-8s to the Philippine Air Force, and I had occasion to see one of those not too long ago. Well, I guess I had in the civil world, I had a client in the Philippines who, among other things, owned Philippine Airlines and a number of hotels. He was actually a Chinese gentleman by the name of Dr. Tan, and he moved to the Philippines right after World War II and made his money importing beer and cigarettes, and then bought Philippine Airlines and developed a number of hotels. And so in any event, his director of flight operations for the airline was a guy who had flown F-8s in the Philippine Air Force and was one of the very few that I'd ever, he claimed that it was too dangerous. They didn't have a very successful operation with it, unfortunately. These are French Navy Crusaders. You can see the different paint job, and also I don't know exactly what that is, but you can see at the top of the vertical stabilizer, that device up there, that's some form of a surface-to-air missile warning device. And these French guys would attend all of our Crusader reunions up until they started flying the Rafale, so I met quite a few of them. Wonderful people and really excellent. They operated these on, they had two smaller carriers, the Foch and the Clemenceau, and they operated those on the smaller carriers through the year 2000. Now, I got issued this leather jacket in 1963 in Pensacola. And I'm a pretty modest guy, but I think the reason that I'm showing this, I wore it to one of those reunions. That's been within the last 10 years. So I wanted to show you that I can still fit in a jacket that I got in 1963. And then what about life after the Marine Corps? Well, this is our family in Las Vegas at the Wynn Hotel in the Sinatra Room, and we're celebrating our 50th wedding anniversary. On the left is our son, a younger, better-looking Jim Markel, who we call Jimmy, and he now works in Hong Kong and runs a pretty large company over there. And Bev, then me, and our daughter Christy. We're very, very proud of our kids, our accomplishments, but mostly when Bev and I were talking about getting married and we were talking about children, we decided people get you steering on a track where you're trying to figure out where they're going to go to college, and they're not even born yet. So we decided that our number one goal for our kids was to have them be nice people, and I think we've succeeded. So now I told you Chance Vought was big on promotion, so when they were competing against the F4s, they developed this Schlitz beer commercial was that when you're out of Schlitz, you're out of beer. So they changed it to say, when you're out of F-8s, you're out of fighters. And then they had this picture of a naval aviator with a tear in his right eye. And they used that until they lost the contract. And that's the gunfighter, the F-8, the last of the gunfighters, purpose-built with the guns as a primary weapon. And I want to thank you very much for the opportunity to be here with you. I want to thank you also for your membership in EAA. I think it's a wonderful organization that contributes a lot. Thank you so very much.
So a couple things here. By the way, while he was here, Jim became a lifetime member today. So he's now a lifetime EA member. But as you already know, a little ritual that we've been doing, thanks to Mr. Jackson here, is a set of commemorative chalks. We just want to thank you and your wife for coming all this way to spend some time with us. We try to get colors close to your squadron, but it has an F8 on it and some anchors on the end. So thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate it. It's an honor to have you here. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, guys. Feel free to come up and ask your question and meet Jim and ask all the F8 questions you like. As always, thank you all for coming out, supporting the museum and the speaker series. We really greatly appreciate it. So thank you, guys. Have a good evening.